this video on the causes of the Civil War, we will focus on the issue of slavery in the federal territories and the election of 1860. We've been talking about the focus on slavery in the federal territories as the core cause of conflict leading up to the Civil War, because the federal government can't affect slavery in a given state. Federal government power does, however, fully extend to the territory of the United States, not the states, but the territories. And remember that the territory of the United States encompasses the vast area past the Mississippi that is rapidly applying for statehood. Therefore, the anti-slavery position is, with the exception of a handful of newspaper writers and novelists and a few politicians who actually want abolition or end of slavery in the southern states, the key anti-slavery gold standard position in the 1850s is non-extension of slavery to the federal territories. Some people actually want abolition for moral, political, social, economic reasons. Some people who support this position, they want merely to restrict the power of the, quote, slave power conspiracy, which some people in their reading of American history and politics at the time viewed that was present and was a major force in American politics at the time, were powerful slave owners. And they wanted to promote free land and free labor in the West. Remember, many people are merely politically trying to control the South. Some of them actually want abolition of slavery. Probably the biggest chunk of Republicans that want non-extension want to promote free land and free labor because they believed it was good for northern whites, and they weren't necessarily on a crusade to help African Americans. They were, or people who were in slavery, they wanted to promote free land and free labor for whites in the West. In the 1850s, you had some evolution in political parties. You'd had previously the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party, but in the mid-1850s, you had the formation of the Republican Party. They pick up the ashes of the Whig Party and predominantly pick up on the tariff and the bank and internal improvements and things that the Whigs wanted. And it will also see the split of the Democratic Party in the 1850s. A key event in the 1850s that highlights this issue were the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, not for president, but for the 1858 Illinois Senate race between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. The two men took the differing positions for Illinois, for Republican versus Democrat, where Lincoln took the position of non-extension and Douglas took the position of popular sovereignty. Remember that Douglas was the author of that Kansas-Nebraska Act that repealed the Missouri Compromise, repealed the ban on slavery in most of the Louisiana Purchase, and instead implemented popular sovereignty in almost all of the federal territory. Lincoln opposed that and promoted non-extension of slavery to any of the federal territories. This was a bitter and contentious race which Douglas defeated Lincoln and won re-election to his Illinois Senate seat. The big election of 1860 is one of the most monumental in American history. One of the key events is the fact that the Democratic Party was split. They had a series of deadlock over who their candidate would be, what their platform would be. In the end, Northern Democrats won out with the idea that they would represent popular sovereignty, not the position that slavery follows the flag, that slavery is guaranteed in the territories, the more assertive position, and in fact, the position that the Dred Scott court case and the Supreme Court seemed to guarantee. In response to this, delegates from the Deep South states storm out of the convention. With them out of the convention and the deadlock is resolved, and the remaining Northern Democrats nominate Senator Stephen Douglas, Democrat of Illinois, under his landmark position, popular sovereignty. That would be the solution for slavery in the federal territories, is let the people decide for themselves. The Deep South delegates have a second Southern convention. There, they nominate former Vice President John Breckinridge, Democrat from Kentucky, as a Deep South Democrat, as a Southern Democrat. Their position is extension of slavery to all of the territories. They believe this is the only logical consequence of the Dred Scott court case, which was ruled heavily in the favor of the South. Remember Chief Justice Roger Taney's obiter dictum promoting the spread of slavery in the territories. They argue slavery follows the flag. There's still another party that forms called the Constitutional Union Party that runs in 1860. Their slogan is "The Union as it is, the Constitution as it is." That all of these changes and disputes and that slavery is tearing the country apart and that no one wants that. They nominate former Senator John Bell, Democrat from Tennessee, to be the Constitutional Union Party candidate. Their platform is compromise somehow, that the Union, the Constitution, used to not deal with this issue of deciding slavery in the territories, so neither should we. They also will be running in the election of 1860. Most significantly is the Republican Party. At their convention, they have 4 major candidates who all gather a number of electors in their convention primary process. The frontrunner was Senator William Henry Seward, a longtime Whig, longtime Republican, and he was the most radical on the issue of slavery. He came closest to William Lloyd Garrison and the position of ending slavery no matter what. He was a sophisticated, urbane statesman who had quite a reputation and was a New Yorker, which brought him a lot of backing from a very populous state. You also had Governor Salmon P. Chase, who was not a Whig but a former Democrat, and therefore weak on tariffs, which made him unpopular with a lot of Republicans who were more Whiggish and pro-tariff. He was just as radical on slavery, but he was lacking in personal charisma. He often thought, because his fishy-sounding name made him a little self-conscious, but he was not as long of a Whig and Republican as Seward was, and he was not as sophisticated. You also had former Representative Edward Bates of Missouri, who had retired. He was recently a Democrat, but the Republicans thought that would make him an attractive candidate because he might pull away many other Democrats. Remember, the Republicans are a brand new party who have never won. Remember that the Whigs often, the 2 times that the Whigs ever won, it was by running someone who wasn't really a Whig, an old war hero like William Henry Harrison or Zachary Taylor. So many people thought, hey, someone who was very recently a Democrat might be the best Republican. And so they had many people push for him. As someone who was very recently a Democrat and someone who was from a slave state, he was by far the most moderate on slavery, and so was most willing to compromise with the Democrat position. And then you had the man from Illinois, the former Representative Abraham Lincoln. He had served in the Illinois House 1 term. He had served in the U.S. House 1 term. He had run for several other offices unsuccessfully, but he was a reasonably successful lawyer. He was a very articulate moderate. He was moderate within the Democratic field. He had been known as an articulate man by anyone who had met him, but also from his famous debates against Stephen Douglas, which were republished in many newspapers. And so he gained a name for himself with how clever and articulate and well-spoken he was. He was very popular as a Westerner, very popular as a border man, because again, back then, Illinois is much closer to the West. He was very famous for telling stories with this homespun type of humor, and yet he was also had a very clear mind and was quite sharp and regarded as brilliant by those who heard him. In the early balloting, Seward led, but after the first round, it began swinging towards Lincoln, because there were those who supported, a big chunk that supported Chase, who would never vote for Seward. A big chunk supported Seward and never vote for Chase. And Lincoln, as kind of a compromise candidate in this contested election, becomes the Republican nominee. And their platform is the famous non-extension of slavery to the federal territories. They also support other Whiggish stuff like internal improvements, such as a transcontinental railroad, such as expanding the Homestead Act out to the west and encouraging more settlement to the west, encouraging a strong protective tariff to promote local industries. Other than the position of non-extension, they make no mention of the Dred Scott court case, which, if you recall, had basically ruled this key provision, non-extension of slavery to federal territories. The Supreme Court had ruled that basically unconstitutional when it struck down the Missouri Compromise. So imagine this. You have a major party and a major candidate running, and its main chunk of the party platform is something that the Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional just 3 years earlier. No mention of the fugitive slave law, which many Northerners, especially anti-slavery men, were very much opposed to. No mention of enhancing or strengthening personal liberty or personal conscience laws, allowing people to object to federal law and opt out. And definitely no mention of abolitionism. No mention of interfering with slavery in the states where it already existed. The key thing that made Lincoln toxic everywhere in the slave states, everywhere in the South, was this merely prohibiting slavery in the federal territories and therefore from all future states. To moderate Republicans, the idea was to put slavery on a road to a gradual death by preventing any new states from becoming slave states, so that perhaps within 20 or 40 years there would be a large majority of states that were prohibiting slavery. But this was far down the road. What happens in 1860? A crazy election in a popular vote where 4.8 million votes were cast. You had Lincoln winning the most, but if you add up the others, you had nearly 2.9 million people who voted not for Lincoln. He gets something like 39% of the popular vote. But in the Electoral College, he sweeps. He carries the North. He carries basically all of the free states and gets 180 out of 303 electoral votes. Stephen Douglas, who has a huge popular vote showing, only carries 2 states. Really, Missouri, and gets a few electoral votes elsewhere. Bell actually has a reasonably strong showing by carrying a few of the middle states, even though his popular vote wasn't very strong. And Breckinridge of the Deep South carries the Deep South. 11 states, 72 electoral votes. The irony here, there were kind of 2 elections. In the North, it was Lincoln versus Douglas. In the South, it was Breckinridge versus Bell. And so in the North, Lincoln defeats Douglas in almost every northern state and wins the Electoral College. He wins without a single electoral vote for a slave state. He was not even on the ballot in most of the southern states. Before the election even happened, many Southerners said, hey, if Lincoln were somehow to win, we would secede. His position, by their party taking a position contrary to the Supreme Court, it shows their disrespect for the law. It is a threat to the South, and this in turn had many Northerners feeling bullied, and many people voted for Lincoln perhaps to just spite the South. When the news of Lincoln's victory happens, remember, the popular vote is known and the electoral vote is known in November. But Lincoln will not be inaugurated until March. In many ways, it is a spark, like the assassination of the Archduke in World War I. It will spark a chain reaction of secession, the formation of the Confederacy, and the firing on Fort Sumter. It'll lead to more secession, and then Lincoln's invasion of the southern states. And this concludes the 3 S's: states' rights, slavery, sectionalism, all culminating in slavery in the federal territories. Lincoln threatened that and therefore threatened the South, and this will provoke the secession crisis beginning in December of 1860 that will directly lead to the Civil War. Thanks for watching.